All right, Krishna, everyone. This is the acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology. This is part 2 of my series on the Sri Isopanisad, which I've lovingly called the Bhakti Upanishad, but that's not actually its name. I'm just doing it for the sake of a little simpler titling. So if you haven't already, make sure that you start with the first part of the series because they are moving in order and building upon one another. So start at the beginning if you haven't yet. In this video today, we're going to look at the first mantra. We looked at the invocation in the last video. So let's go ahead and take a look. And just a little bit of a reminder of what the Sri Isopanishad is. Remember that the Upanishads are the ancient philosophical summaries and commentaries upon the Vedas. And in yoga philosophy, the Vedas are thought of as divine scriptures that teach us about the truth of reality and of human nature and of divinity and the soul. And then the Upanishads come down through that same stream of divinely inspired sacred texts. And the Upanishads are the ancient philosophical summaries, commentaries, elaborations upon the Vedas. Now, the Sri Upanishad is the Upanishad of the Lord. Isha means Lord, and it was written in poetic verse. It consists of 18 verses. And you might remember that I said that this Upanishad is particularly famous for its treatment of the soul's personal loving relationship with God, and is therefore often cited by students of Bhakti Yoga. It's one of the most studied, revered Upanishads, you could say, coming through the Bhakti Yoga tradition. So let's read mantra 1, which is the next mantra in order of giving from where we left off after the invocation. This verse reads, "Everything animate or inanimate that is within the universe is controlled and owned by the Lord. One should therefore accept only those things necessary for himself, which are set aside as his quota, and one must not accept other things, knowing well to whom they belong." Simple, sweet verse. And remember, this is coming from the Sri Isopanishad. You can pick it up on Amazon by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. This is the monk who brought the Hare Krishna Bhakti Yoga tradition to the United States in the 1960s. And he was a very erudite guy who, saintly acharya of the tradition, like one of the saintly leaders of the lineage. And he translated many different traditional yogic scriptures, including the Srimad Bhagavatam and so many others. So it's really quite cool to see his commentary. Like I said last time, it was written in the 60s. So he talks in, some things are quite clearly references to what was happening back then. And he was also born, I think it was in the 1890s. So, you might notice some of the cultural differences, but it is just deeply valuable content. So let's break this down little by little. Everything animate or inanimate that is within the universe is controlled and owned by the Lord. So that covers everything, right? And then one should therefore accept only those things necessary for himself, which are set aside as his quota. And one must not accept other things, knowing well to whom they belong. When I was a kid, my dad, who was a kind of a Universalist Methodist minister, had a bumper sticker on his Jeep Wrangler. And, this is like, I don't know, I'm sure he got it at a head shop somewhere. And it said, "Live simply so that others may simply live." And this is sort of one of the cornerstones of how God consciousness is thought to be cultivated in Bhakti Yoga, which is to say that we recognize that we're not ultimately the owner or controller of everything, that we're not the possessor of everything, that the things that we have don't really belong to us, and that therefore we should live modestly, live simply, and be really careful about the elaborate amount of things that we need and want. Now, for me to be saying this is already just so hypocritical, considering what I have that I need and don't need, and the kind of world that we live in, and the compared in some ways to other times in the world, we live like kings and queens. My guru sometimes says, air conditioning in the house maybe, or, all these luxuries that we have. But at any rate, the simple point of this verse is that we should be very careful not to think of ourselves as owners, possessors, or controllers. Now, there's a verse that, a purport from this verse in the text, if you read it, And I'm just taking a little excerpt from it, that from Swami Prabhupada. And here's what it says: the root of sin is deliberate disobedience to the laws of nature through not recognizing the proprietorship of the Lord. Disobedience to the laws of nature, or disobedience to the order of the Lord, will bring ruin to the human being. On the other hand, if one is sober and knows the laws of nature without being influenced by unnecessary attachment or abhorrence, that's likes or dislikes, he's sure to be recognized by the Lord and thus become eligible for going back to Godhead, back to the eternal home. Now, there's a lot to break down in this, but the simple piece of what he's saying here is that, again, in his commentary, he's saying what brings a person ruin, or what brings even human civilization ruin. And to a certain extent, it is living selfishly, demanding and craving more than we need, and also being driven by desires or aversions. So the more that we are driven by desires and aversions, likes and dislikes, the more we're living from a place of selfishness. And that's the basic idea behind this purport and the verse. And that if we can step back and realize, actually, I'm just passing through here. I'm not the owner. I'm not the possessor. I'm not the controller. And we can take that mood. It's like water rolling off the lotus flower. We don't get stuck to anything. And we also, when we cut back on the amount of things that we think we need, or cutting back on that attitude of being the controller and the possessor, it's that attitude of I don't own or possess anything, I'm not in control of everything, that starts to help us see God, and that also allows God to see us. So it's like a two-way street. And that's what makes us eligible to evolve in spiritual life. So even though, as we started with in verse 1, actually, let's revisit the invocation verse really briefly, because it's just so beautiful. This was the invocation verse from last time. The personality of Godhead is perfect and complete, and because he is completely perfect, all emanations from him, such as this phenomenal world, are perfectly equipped as a complete whole. Whatever is produced to the complete whole is also complete by itself. And because he is the complete whole, even though so many complete units emanate from him, he remains the complete balance. So even though, and remember, we kind of started talking about this philosophy, acyuta-bhava, which is simultaneous oneness and difference. Even though each of us, and even the material universe and all beings and everything animate or inanimate, so to speak, is complete and whole unto itself, everything still rests upon and depends upon God. In a way, it's like thinking about a parent and a child on one level. The analogy breaks down at a certain point, but my daughter is completely whole, equipped as a complete perfect whole unto herself. And yet there's a sense in which she is still dependent upon her source, right? So in similar manner, each of us have free will. We each have the ability to make choices. We each have a small, little small sliver of control, and a small little sliver of things that we have or temporarily possess while we're in this body. And that agency is holy and sacred, and no one's trying to take that away by saying, look, you're nothing, you're just a subservient part of the Almighty. You know what I mean? That's not the philosophy. But it is to recognize that in our completeness and our wholeness, we still rest upon and depend upon our source. So we come to recognize that, and then it's very important that we start curbing the attitude of being the owner or controller. And by recognizing this, that I'm not in control ultimately, that I'm not the owner of anything ultimately, I'm a part of God, I belong to God, then we start recognizing who we really are. I'm a part of God. I'm a servant of God. And servant doesn't, again, not thinking of this in a menial way. A lot of the times in this world, when we think of servant, we think of people who are being exploited by people who are powerful. In this sense, what we mean is that I am a loving, beautiful, sacred part of the whole, and my natural disposition is to serve the whole of which I am a part, like a community that functions in loving service to the good of the whole community. So when we recognize that we're not the controller or the owner, that we are spirit souls that rest and depend upon God, that's when we start to awaken to our true nature. And when we awaken to our true nature, then we're compelled to love and serve the whole of which we are a part. And we can't do that unless we are regularly cutting back on that feeling, that illusion, actually that illusion that I'm ultimately in control of my own everything, and I'm ultimately the controller of everything, like that possessor and owner mentality. Now, in the Srimad Bhagavatam, there's a verse that is spoken by God and by Krishna to a Brahmana, who's like a priest. And this all of a sudden turns everything we've just said in the other direction, which becomes really interesting. So here's what Krishna says. He says, the Supreme Personality of Godhead said to the Brahmana, I am completely under the control of my devotees. Indeed, I am not at all independent. Because my devotees are completely devoid of material desires, I sit only within the cores of their hearts. What to speak of my devotee? Even those who are devotees of my devotee are very dear to me. Wow, that's a total paradox. So again, we have this paradox of inconceivable and simultaneous oneness and difference, where God is saying, um, actually, when you recognize that you're completely dependent upon me and you direct all of your focus to loving and serving me, I become owned and controlled by the ones who love me, by my devotees, by my lovers. And so there's a weird way in which, in surrender to the whole of which we are a part, the distinction between owner and owned, whole and part, in a kind of power differential disappears and is overwhelmed by love and reciprocal service and devotion. God becomes purchased, as it were, and equally as attached to God's devotional lovers, devotional servants, as the servant is completely in love with and desiring to serve his quote unquote master. So the master servant gets dissolved in lover, in mutual devotional service back and forth. Now, that is not something that we start with. So in bhakti, most of us we're working against the illusion of being the controller and the possessor. And that means we're starting from a place of selfish interest and of trying to lord power over our environment, over others. And we have to decide, it's on us to sort of dissolve the impersonal paradigm of being a powerful controller. And as we do so, the first step is to surrender and to say, I'm not in control. I'm not the possessor, right? I'm not the owner. And that at first is very humbling to the ego and requires a submission of our will. And in a sense, there is a way in which we have to allow ourselves to come under the power of someone and something that is bigger than us. But ultimately, as we keep loving, as we keep serving, God becomes owned, purchased and controlled by those that love him. And then these distinctions of power differential vanish. And this is why cultivation of personal love of God in bhakti, we don't start with this deep, intimate exchange of love that feels super equal. In some ways, in the beginning, God does feel like a parent who's way up here, and we're like little children. Or God feels like a CEO that we're serving, trying to make a better company, a better community. You know what I mean? And that power differential, for a lot of people, at the very beginning, is like a non-starter. It's like, yeah, I can't get into that because I can't conceptualize God as, someone who's more powerful. When it comes to power, a lot of us have been very wounded by power. And so there's an aversion to any understanding of ourselves as servants of the all-powerful, right? But again, in bhakti, that's absolutely not where it starts. That's only where it begins, as we are relinquishing the tendency that we have to try and be powerful in comparison to others or over our environment. And the more that is replaced by the desire to serve, by putting ourselves in the negative, in the more submissive position of serving and loving others and serving and loving God, then we experience God with the power differential vanishes, and we start to experience God in much more personal ways and much more reciprocal ways. So that's not at all where, where I am, but I can tell you that when we finish this series, we're going to be looking at some of the practices of bhakti yoga that help us to start cultivating love, devotion, and service to God. And as you cultivate those practices, I've only been chanting for a few years regularly, but I can tell you right now that the reciprocation of bhakti yoga practices is really, really real. And you can start to feel God coming into the heart and speaking to you. And for me, very quickly, the sense of, you know, um, me as like some, little thing in contrast to the Almighty, that has not at all been really a part of my experience of bhakti yoga. But I can say that just like a 12-step program, if any of you have family members who are in a 12-step program, I have some. Um, there is a stage where we have to realize I'm not in control, I'm not the possessor, I'm not the owner, and humble ourselves. And in the beginning, I found that was challenging to my ego, but very quickly through the practices of devotion, it gets replaced with sweetness, tenderness, and an exchange that feels so intimate and personal. So, anyway, I hope that you're enjoying this series. And I hope that you are checking out the Sri Upanishad, reading along on your own. And I look forward to diving into the next mantra with you shortly. If you have any questions about this, or any comments you'd like to make, any reflections you'd like to add, info@nightlightastrology.com. That's where to find me. And until then, until next time, I look forward to continuing on with you. And I hope you have a great day. Hare Krishna.